Okay, we are live.
Thank you. So I'd like to call this planning committee meeting to order at 10:02 on March 25th. And the first order of business is to ask for any declarations of pecuniary. And not hearing any, I will move on to the next topic, which is the adoption of the agenda. So the agenda has been circulated. Hopefully everybody has received it. And the motion will read, be it resolved that the planning committee adopts the agenda of March 25th, 2022 as circulated. And I have a mover, Armin, and seconder, Peter, and all in favor. Carried. Thank you. Next item of business is the minutes of the meeting of February 25th, 22 as circulated. Are there any errors, omissions, corrections that need to be considered? There being none, can I ask for a mover? That would be Bill, and a seconder, Jack. And all in favor? And that is carried. Okay, so let's move into the agenda. And what am I thinking about? So the first item of business is a waterfront policy review update, but I have been asked by our acting CAO to allow her a few minutes to speak to our committee. And so can I ask Julie to give us a little update on her perspective.
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. I just wanted to say hello to everybody because I don't believe I met everybody yet. And so welcome, and I'm happy to be here and sitting in to listen today. And I wanted just to, because some members are new, just read a blurb of the terms of reference where the mandate of the committee is. So the mandate of the committee is to work with staff, consultant, and community stakeholders to develop and recommend new or revised land use planning policies, bylaws, and regulations when requested to do so by the committee of the whole or council. And so the role of the committee is to provide support to the planning department during creation, modification of policies, regulation, and bylaw, as well as during the establishment / revisions to procedures and approaches to public consultation, education, and information sharing. So I just wanted to read those blurbs so that, you know, kind of like a statement when we start a meeting that we start off all on the same page. So we are currently working with Chair Hazelton to improve our internal processes and so on. So if there's ever any questions, I'm sure Chair Hazelton, myself, and our Director of Planning, Dr. Chris Ascola, would be more than willing to accept comments, suggestions, either by email or by phone or any other matter you can get a hold of us. Email is probably best. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. So one of the, so we have two topics today that we have on the agenda that are structured. I didn't hear of any new business items. So the first topic I understand from Dr. Aspa was that staff are going to give us an update on the waterfront policy review. So shall I turn it over to you, Dr. Aspa?
Thank you. And Jason Farragon, our lead consultant from JL Richards, has been kind enough to prepare a presentation for the committee today. So Jason, we'll turn it over to you for the presentation, and both Jason and I will be available for any subsequent discussion and questions that arise from the presentation. So Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Espila. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today together with members of Administration and Planning Committee, and have the opportunity to continue the conversation, if you will, with Planning Committee around the Waterfront Policy Review. Before I jump into things, I just want to do just sort of a quick sound check. Perhaps Chair Hazelton, signal if you can hear me okay. That's great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So what Dr. Espila and I have done in preparation of the meeting today is just prepared a very brief presentation in order to update Planning Committee on sort of where we are and what we sort of anticipate the next steps will be with respect to this study. So if it's okay with you, Chair Hazelton, I'll call the presentation up. We'll sort of go through it as sort of quickly as we can, and really sort of want to get into the discussion, if you will, with Planning Committee. So some of the information I'll warn committee members, for some is a repeat of existing information that you've heard. We're very hopeful, of course, that you'll see your previous feedback to us reflected in the presentation that we're just about to go through, but certainly for new members, so for Member Folds and Members Davis, this could potentially represent new information. And so we want to make sure that we're sort of providing everybody with sort of the same context before we jump off and launch this very important study for the township. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And with that, everyone else will disappear from my view momentarily. So bear with me while I do that, and then we can go through the presentation itself. Oh, and I'm told that the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. It's a great presentation. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
It's amazing how you can be so succinct on such an important matter.
It is
You should be
a
able to
rare
share.
day. Thank you. It is a rare day, Chair Hazelton, that I am this succinct. Yes. Okay, let's sort of see. So I should be able to now. There we go. And let's see. So can everyone see this? And I'll need a verbal on that, sorry, because I actually don't see anyone anymore.
Yes,
Thank you.
Can see that. Still there.
Great.
We can see it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So in the short time that we do have with Planning Committee today, what Dr. Espila and I were hoping to do was just to sort of cover off the points that we've listed here on this introductory slide. So, you know, begin at the beginning. All good stories begin at the beginning. So we'd like to sort of revisit the intent of the study. We'll go through the geographic areas of focus, which we had developed last year with Planning Committee and with Township Council as well. We'll dive into some of the what we're describing as the initial policy and regulatory review areas. And you'll see when we get to this segment of the presentation, really the scope of the review is sort of coming together through conversation and consultation. And I'll speak to that further when I get to that slide. In the past, we've talked about approach to stakeholder engagement. So we have some information to share there. We'll sort of check in quickly on the process and sort of the road ahead, if you will. And then, as I sort of said at the outset, really sort of curious to sort of get any additional feedback from Planning Committee at this point in time in the study. So Planning Committee members will recall that when we talked about this sort of project last year, we had many good conversations around it, and ultimately the outcome in terms of you know, those conversations and the intent of the study is reflected on this slide here. So in the first instance, what we're attempting to do is to review the effectiveness of Georgian Bay's existing framework. And when I say framework, I mean both the official plan policies as well as the zoning regulations. So we're here to look at the framework and its effectiveness in responses to changes that have occurred in the external environment since the official plan and the zoning bylaw came into effect respectively. And there's certainly been a considerable amount of change. I think the second, we heard loud and clear from Planning Committee and sort of Council that one of the outcomes that they wish to ensure in terms of the studies, that a more consistent approach is taken to planning across the township, where that can be achieved, of course, and recognizing that Georgian Bay has many distinct and unique waterfront communities. So, through the study, we're going to want to ensure that the outcomes of the study continue to maintain that delicate balance between what I would sort of describe as a general approach to planning, which is meant to apply township-wide, and balancing that against the unique characteristics of Georgian Bay's communities. And then, of course, as well, in terms of outcomes, what we hope to achieve by sort of, the summertime of this year is that we have identified a series of housekeeping changes that can be addressed in this year and in this term of council. But knowing planning as we do, and I think we've all been through processes like this in the past, we know that certain things will be brought to our attention or come into our radar screen that we won't necessarily be able to address, both in the time and the scope that we sort of have in front of us. And sort of those longer term issues, I think, then will form the basis of subsequent work that Planning Committee, Council, and Administration will do in terms of sort of longer term policy issues and potentially addressing those through a review of the official plan. So in terms of the areas that we're looking at in the Waterfront Policy Review, the areas clearly align both with Muskoka's official plan as well as Georgian Bay's official plan, with one sort of key addition which came through conversation last year, and this is sort of reflected on the slide, and I won't read the bullet points for bullet points, but we're basically looking at the waterfront area as defined in those two planning documents, together with the waterfront areas in what could be described as the settlement areas within Georgian Bay, so Port Severn, MacTier, and Honey Harbor. And when we consulted last year, I think that was something that some feedback that we had received from council. And I think the feedback was, in some cases, it makes sense to look at the waterfront areas in both the rural and the urban settlement areas. So that is kind of the geographic areas of focus for this particular study at this time. Now, in terms of the things that we're looking at, right now, what this slide is intending to do is sort of demonstrate a layering of ideas, if you will. So on the left-hand side, we have items which we've previously discussed with Planning Committee from the council-approved work plan that we have talked about folding those items into the Waterfront Policy Review. So they're listed there in the first sort of box on your left-hand side of the screen. The second box, then moving to the right, reflects some of the feedback that we had received both from Planning Committee and Council last year as we were developing the terms of reference. So, you sort of see the ideas beginning to layer on top of each other here. As we move to the third box on your right, which is titled Administration 2022 Feedback, we're beginning to put some ideas on the table ourselves, both administration as staff, through our sort of experience in working with the document. So the one item that we've listed here, and there are more, but the one item that we've listed here for discussion today is the approach that's taken to undersized lots within the planning document. Those regulations are something that are there, and they're a very strong framework, and something that we're sort of discussing both as consultants and administration in terms of the intent and the implementation of those. And then the final box on the right is just a placeholder, and what it's designed to indicate really is that as we go through this process together, we will continue to hear other ideas, both from stakeholders and from members of the public, that they will want to include in the process, and which we hope that they will. And when those ideas are presented, we will review and analyze those as those come forward. So this is intended to sort of indicate a layering of ideas, if you will, and it's a static image, and it's meant to reflect where we are today. And I certainly hope and expect that that will continue to change as we move through this process together. Now, in terms of stakeholders, I think it was the meeting in January or February, we had a really good discussion with Planning Committee around, who are the stakeholders in this study, and what this very simple graphic attempts to do. And I apologize for the simplicity in the graphic. I developed it myself. For those who know me know that I don't have really great graphic skills. But what it's intended to do is basically reflect the feedback that we've heard. So I think the last time we got together, we've heard loud and clear from Planning Committee that, a key stakeholder in this process are the 14 community and cottage associations, which exist within Georgian Bay Township. We fully agree. So they're definitely on the radar screen for consultation. We heard a lot about many of the important environmental and sustainability associations that exist within Georgian Bay and that function within Georgian Bay, and that have very clear mandates to preserve and protect the quality of the natural environment. So we'll be checking in with those groups too. And then on the right hand of the screen are some of the other stakeholders that were identified through consultation with Planning Committee. So of course we have the Chamber of Commerce. There'll be some government and public agencies that we're going to want to check in with as well. The District Municipality of Muskoka obviously being probably the primary example there, as well as with the many Indigenous communities in the Georgian Bay area. So that is our sort of preliminary stakeholder list. Like the list of issues, the list of stakeholders that we're illustrating here really represents a starting point for the study. And this list of stakeholders, I expect, will continue to evolve as well as we sort of go through the process and as we learn, I think, new things together. So in terms of engagement, Dr. Espila and I have had some really good discussions about how we can apply some of the principles and the processes that come from the International Association of Public Participation to this particular assignment. And what this graphic is attempting to represent is the outcome of our thought process. So as Planning Committee members are probably aware, there are degrees of consultation, if you will, and Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, for those who went to planning school will remember that the principles and the methods of engagement from the International Association of Public Participation are really the next stage in the evolution of the thinking that Arnstein originally published many, many, many decades ago. And so in the top row there, what we're sort of saying is, the top row basically defines the degrees and the types of consultation, from informing either a stakeholder or a member of the public to empowering someone to make a decision, or empowering a group to make a decision. And then what we've listed in the left-hand column are the tools that we currently envisage ourselves using, ranging from traditional sort of notices that would go out, in an e-blast by the township or something that's sort of published online, all the way to meetings of Planning Committee and the decisions that Planning Council will be presented, the choices that they will be offered to make it the outcome of this process. And then you'll sort of see how we've mapped them basically. So traditional notices are great ways to inform and consult with people, as an example, but they don't really empower people to make decisions. So you take that at one end of the extreme, and then you look at the role that Planning Committee and Planning Council are expected to play in this process. And you'll sort of see that there's a greater degree, obviously, of involvement, of collaboration. And then in Planning Council's case, because they ultimately will make the decisions on the recommendations that will come from this study, the study process itself is designed to empower them to make those informed choices around changes to both the official plan and the zoning bylaw. So in terms of the process, I think as we talked about last time, we got a little bit of a delayed start, but that's okay. We're here and we're beginning. So what Dr. Espila and I have done is sort of mapped out our best thinking in a very rough way around how the study will unfold. So we are firmly within the project startup phase. So that is the month of March, which I can't believe ends next week, but the project is officially underway. In April, we're going to go through the understanding phase. So this represents in the understanding phase a very significant amount of research to wrap our arms and our minds around both the issues and the opportunities that are before us. Once we have a good level of understanding around what we're dealing with, then we'll be reaching out to stakeholders and members of the public to engage them in a conversation, to test our level of understanding, if you will. From there, we're going to go away and we're going to think about what we heard and reflect on that and develop preliminary directions and recommendations. From there, we anticipate coming back out again, consulting with stakeholders and members of the community, on those directions and recommendations. We will be taking their feedback, reflecting on their feedback, and finalizing everything into a series of recommendations, which is described here as housekeeping recommendations for both Planning Committee's consideration and Planning Council's consideration later in the summer. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be some longer term policy type things that will likely come through this process that will occur sort of at a later date. So what I'm indicating here is post 2022. So I would sort of say, you know, for Planning Committee's benefit, the timing here, as I sort of said, is sort of very rough. In my mind, it's conservative in the sense that this is probably the maximum amount of time that we need to do the work that's sort of before us. But we thought we would be conservative in the sort of timing. If we can do the work quicker, we sort of certainly will. But this is sort of the schedule as it stands this week. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will stop sharing my screen, and I am happy to take any questions from members of Planning Committee, and look forward to the discussion and any additional guidance or direction that Planning Committee wishes to provide us with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. And Dr. Espilla, did you want to add anything before we open it to the floor?
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. At this point, we're really looking for guidance and feedback from the Planning Committee, and please open the floor.
So I'd like to start off. I just want to ask Armin a question here. Armin, you had expressed interest in a few topics. You weren't able to attend our last meeting, and so we kind of deferred interest in those topics to kind of your guidance, but you had talked about shore platforms and I think two other items, which Jason had on his short list. And so let me see, they were shore platforms, building heights, and walkway definitions. And I didn't want to lose sight of those. I'm not sure if you saw those in Jason's presentation or if you were looking to extract those outside of the waterfront policy review and try to see if we could get them on a future agenda.
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. And yeah, I mean, I think we talked about this at one of the previous meetings, that it's maybe more of an urgent matter than if we put it under the waterfront policy review. Chances are there's not going to be any meaningful change. And I feel that with the crazy fluctuations in water level, the water's way down, by the way, guys. I don't know how many of you have been watching, but I'm just astounded how low it is again. So I think it's very important that we reconsider how these dock and shore platform and walkway regulations are interpreted and enforced by planning and by the building department. Because every year when we get these big fluctuations, you know, somebody might have just built a dock, as many people did when the water went way up a couple of years ago. A lot of people made major changes and invested a lot of money putting in an infrastructure, which maybe now the dock needs to be moved out a little further if there's a challenge with water depths or whatever. And so I think there's a way that we can do that without being offensive or without, you know, promoting undue shoreline development. And the walkway idea is one that I know, if you permit me a moment to explain one example, is that a couple of years ago, I brought forward a proposal where shore platforms are allowed currently to be about 440 square feet, roughly. And their location differs from, in Honey Harbor, you can do it from the high water mark inland, Cognachine, and go home. It's, you know, has to be 5 meters or 16 feet behind or higher than the high water mark and so forth. But what the one proposal did was, you know, I said, well, not everybody wants to build a 440 square foot shore platform, or can they afford it? But would we not allow someone to reconfigure that square footage into a 6 foot wide walkway for up to 440 square feet, independent of the dock and the ramp provisions that currently exist? And I think it would be a fairly inobtrusive way to allow people to get to their shoreline, whether the water is extremely high or extremely low. And so anyway, I'm happy to, if the rest of the committee agrees, then I feel it would be appropriate to deal with this outside of the waterfront review, as I think it's a more urgent matter. And one of the other things that we brought up was, you're concerned about shoreline alteration. Well, if somebody can't get to their property because their point of attachment for the dock that now has a lake behind it because the waters are high enough, they're going to get across that no matter what. I mean, even if the regulations don't permit it, somebody's going to build a boardwalk or they'll do whatever to get to the other side. And I'm not talking about new development here. I'm talking about existing cottages that are having challenges with access. Let's face it, we're all getting a little older, and I used to be able to walk around the gunnels of a boat and not fall in the lake, and I wouldn't even want to try that today because I'm going to get wet. But we need to be concerned about access and accessibility and so forth, even for able-bodied people. And I think this is one way we could do it without creating any problems.
Thank you, Armin. Dr. Spilla, you wanted to weigh in on this?
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. Through you to Member Gagis and to the rest of the committee. So the waterfront policy review, we're looking at bringing what I'll call the low-hanging fruit items forward through our first set of amendments, and we're looking at a timeline to bring those forward this summer. At the present, the planning department is primarily focused on operational issues and the processing of development applications. I would suggest to the committee that, given the priorities that have been assigned by council and identified by administration, that the most expedient way to address this matter is through the waterfront policy review. So I'll leave that for your consideration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the things that, if I can just touch back to what Julie was saying at the beginning, we have a terms of reference that is evolving a little bit. I think one of the things that we have as a committee voiced opinions on items that we want to cover. Again, the terms of committee that Julie highlighted is really, we work on items that are directed to us by council. And so part of the conversations that I think Julie was highlighting is we do have an open dialogue right now with Julie and staff to discuss how we may be able to impact the agenda items of the planning committee. And so I don't think there's any need to talk about that further, but I did want to give Armin the opportunity to share his opinions on that, and then that perhaps will help shape future agendas. So thank you for that, Armin, and
thank you,
Dr. Spilla. Cycling back to the other items that Jason had covered with the various stages of the work plan and the various following steps. Any more conversation, discussion on those items? Beth.
Thank you, and I'm really pleased to see, Jason and Dr. Aspila, that you've got the community associations involved and engaged, or will have them engaged in this process. My question relates to you coming back to our planning committee for hopefully some input on some of these various things, and I'm glad to see they're all on your list. The docks and PHW, undersized islands, a whole bunch of things that were on the left column of that slide. And we do have a schedule now to meet monthly, but these are a lot of items. And if you're coming back to our committee to discuss them specifically and seeking our input, which is great and appreciate that, how are we going to handle that? Is it like one item an agenda, two items an agenda? You can't cover all of those in one meeting, and I'm just not sure where that input from planning committee plays into your schedule. Is it continuous as we go? Or is it after you've had the public engagement, you come back to the planning committee? Because if that's the case, it's going to be hard to address all of those in any meaningful discussion at one or even two meetings.
Dr. Espila?
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. So our approach to this is going to be continuous consultation. Member Halpenny is correct that we typically only have time to deal with 2 items at any level of substantial discussion at Planning Committee. So our intent is to address the highest priority items related to the Waterfront Policy Review Committee. And we're gonna work with that as we set future agendas. With that in mind, we're also intending to bring the draft report in advance of it going to Planning Council based on the information that we've received, the consultation that we've received. And so that will be coming back. And I realize our timelines are a little tight. They are doable, however. That's Jason and my professional evaluation of our scenario and what we have to work with. There is also the opportunity for the more longer term issues to be addressed beyond the first report. So beyond summer of 2022. And some of those issues we may identify based on our professional recommendations as registered professional planners, that they may be best dealt with through longer term planning initiatives, as Jason mentioned in the presentation, such as a more fulsome official plan review. And that's something that we have to review. And that's part of the purpose for why we're doing this waterfront policy review. Thank you.
Other comments?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, just can I ask again, and Jason, maybe if you can go back to that particular slide that had all of the items on the left-hand column, that seems to be a fairly comprehensive list of priority issues for this committee. And further to Dr. Aspela's comments, are all of those expected to come back to us, or are some of those then to be punted out to 2022? Hopefully not, because they're all important.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, just to supplement Dr. Espila's earlier question and to respond to Member Halpenny's follow-up question. So I think the long and the short of it from my perspective, right, is we have about 5 months to do a whole bunch of work. We know the issues that are on Planning Committee's list and that Planning Committee is interested in, and those were in the left-hand side of the column. So I think what we're talking about is almost sort of 2 parallel streams of work proceeding at the same time. So we'll be doing the waterfront policy review, if you will, as a study, consulting with stakeholders in the communities on sort of the changes that need to be made. But we also know at the same time that there is a series of low-hanging fruit items, as Dr. Espila has referred to, that need some attention. So in terms of the rhythm of this committee and the number of issues that could be sort of discussed in any given meeting, what I would anticipate is just starting on that list and sort of saying next meeting, we're talking about undersized islands and H2 lift holds. Why wait? Let's just start talking about it. And as we're running those processes in parallel, eventually they'll come together at the end. And we can sort of tie up all of the recommendations at the end and then bring a comprehensive series of recommendations forward to sort of, for Planning Council for consideration. Now, as we go through the process, we may come to an early consensus on certain issues and the changes that need to be made. If that occurs, subject to any comments that Dr. Espila may have, there's no reason to delay that for moving forward in terms of a change that needs to be made. So some things may go sort of later, some things potentially might be able to proceed earlier, but I could sort of see that proceeding in almost 2 streams of conversation, Chair Hazelton. So hopefully that's helpful to Member Halpenny, but I'm happy to take any additional questions.
That was helpful. Thank you very much for you, Mr. Chair.
So if I could,
Hazelton, if I
Go ahead.
may sort of interject for a minute. Jason, so I understand when you say that some items may go forward and some may be delayed or postponed, are we talking adoption by council, or are we talking sort of recommendation? Like this is, the council is ending in November. Do we expect this council to sort of act on these recommendations in this current term of council, or are we looking at after?
So through you, Chair Hazelton, to Member Davis, yes, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify my earlier statement. What I think the intent is to bring a series of recommendations to this council for consideration in the summertime. Some recommendations will be designed to implement changes to the official plan and to the zoning bylaw. So those are the short-term housekeeping recommendations. And then other, I'm going to describe them as observations or recommendations, will be things to include in a subsequent study, including an official plan review. So those are the longer term items. So the goal line is to get something to council this year for housekeeping. What I was attempting to describe earlier is, say, for example, we come to a planning committee meeting and we're talking about lift hold for H2. And at the end of that meeting, we're all feeling pretty comfortable on kind of our perspective on it and what we think the right steps are. What I was attempting to describe was that there's no reason to postpone that recommendation until July or August. It could just pop out of the process and go directly to sort of planning council for consideration, and planning council could make a decision on that independent subject while still knowing that the balance of the recommendations for the waterfront policy review are coming later in the summertime. So I think what I'm trying to signal is we have two different streams of work, and there's going to be opportunities, I think, in moments in the conversation for us to pause or press the gas pedal on certain things as sort of we come to consensus on those.
Thank you. That helps.
Paul, do you want to offer a comment? If you're not, you look frozen right now, but yeah, Paul's been having network problems, so he was with us. He may come back while he's trying to unfreeze himself. Jason, can I ask, have you and Dr. Espila created a priority list for these items in that work plan on where you see the first few items being discussed, or is it just a non-prioritized list at the point in time?
It's an excellent question. So to you, Chair Hazelton, we have not prioritized the list. So if Planning Committee wishes to give us feedback on which items they may want to come to the next meeting, I think we'd be happy to hear that and happy to follow up on that.
Okay, I think that would be ideal. Certainly we have various opinions on some of these items, and you know, some of them may be short-term expeditious items with a little bit of discussion. They can achieve the scenario that you painted a few minutes ago. Others may need more discussion, and I think that's where we're trying to go with this. Looks like Paul might be coming back. Sydney, did you have to let him back in, or did he fall out?
Can you hear me, Paul?
Yes, we can hear you, Paul. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm on my phone. I booted 3 times, so I've gone on my phone. Again, I don't know exactly where you are in the discussions, but one thing I wanted to mention is that the plan indicates that all the recommendations will go to the planning committee. And I think if some of these results are available in August and September, maybe, and since they've probably been discussed in depth by the planning committee, maybe we can avoid going to the planning council and go directly to council for approval on some of these issues. That'll save about a month or more in approval of some of these issues. So the consultants and maybe even council themselves may want to suggest that we bypass planning council on some of these issues.
So Dr. Espila, could I ask you to provide some guidance on this. My understanding is that planning council is equivalent to council. And if it goes to planning council, decisions can be made. It's not equivalent to committee of the whole. Is that your understanding?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. So planning council can make the decision on planning matters with the same authority as council.
Paul, did you hear that?
Yes, I did hear that. Okay, I wouldn't realize that. I thought it was a kind of a committee of the whole. Okay, fair enough.
Okay, so expeditiously handling things, going straight to planning council sounds like a good thing. And I see from Jason's grid that the planning committee stays engaged right through to the kind of final collaboration state. So I think that should give us all comfort that our interests and opinions and passions can continue to be reflected in the process. Beth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to add one comment, and that is that some of these issues are interrelated. For instance, on the H2 and the policies for removal of the H2 provision, one of the things that is essential is for a lot to have water access only lot to have enough water to actually gain access to know whether you can lift a hold and permit development. So the waterfront lot definition and the issue of navigable waterway are all key things to discuss either before or part of the lifting of the H2 provision, because you shouldn't be allowed to develop a lot and have council lift an H2 or staff recommend lift an H2 provision unless you can prove that you can actually get waterfront access or you have waterfront access in all water level conditions, because it's akin to having frontage on a public roadway. You cannot develop, maintain, or sustain a seasonal cottage on a waterfront access property if you don't have the ability to get to it, whether it's to construct or to maintain, septic system, pump out, all of that. So just keep in mind, perhaps, Jason, when these do come forward and you create that agenda, I think we have to have an understanding of what the definition is of navigable waterway and waterfront lot as part of that process when we discuss the lifting of the H2. If you don't mind, thank you.
So rephrasing it just a little bit, there are probably a cluster of a few items that need to be considered together and not in isolation. And this kind of comes back to the comment I made a minute ago to our Director of Planning and to Jason, understanding what your thoughts are from a priority standpoint, and then overlaying this cluster idea that Beth has just highlighted would be, I think, very, very helpful as we go about assigning, agenda items to planning committee for further discussion.
So I can comment on that, Mr. Chair. So we have our initial ideas based on information that we've received from planning committee to date. And as we consult through this process over the next few months, we're going to be gaining additional insight from members of the community, the cottage associations, and all the groups that were mentioned during the presentation. So stepping back, there's going to be our initial focuses based on the information that we have now. We'll be adjusting or refining our focus as we gain additional information from the consultation, and that will help to inform the priorities. I hope that helps to clarify.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion, questions on the waterfront policy review? There being none. My understanding, Dr. Espila, is that you were going to provide an intro to the site plan topic. Is that something that I can turn the baton back to you for?
If we are moving to the next item on the agenda, Mr. Chair, yes, we can turn that back over to Jason and I. Jason will be leading the presentation. And once again, we will be both available for questions and discussion with the committee. Thank you.
Jason, are you going to share your screen again, or is it verbal?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair, and my apologies. You caught me in a technological moment there. So I'm on my laptop this morning and I'm working on a split screen. So I'm trying to call the presentation up and unmute myself at the same time. So thank you and everyone for your patience. So, Mr. Chair, so we do have a second presentation to review, sort of with Planning Committee around site plan and how site plan can be used as a tool to further the township's strategic objectives relating to planning. And in the context of this particular discussion, the first goal in Council's new strategic plan for 2021-2022, which is to protect and preserve the natural environment. I'll just sort of indicate now, so this presentation is slightly longer than the last presentation that I gave. It's approximately about 15, 17, 18 slides in length. I can go through it relatively quickly. My intent is not to put anyone to sleep this morning. But what it does, Mr. Chair, is it just sort of, it's almost like a site plan 101, if you will. So I'm a big believer in all good stories begin at the beginning. So this one starts at the beginning and it kind of works its way through. Eventually, what it's going to culminate in, hopefully, is a discussion amongst Planning Committee around how can we take the current, both the policy and the administrative approach that is used when dealing with site plans within the township to better achieve or better align that practice and those policies with Council's strategic outcome around protecting and preserving the natural environment. So, Mr. Chair, if that is okay with you, then I'll call the presentation up and I will do my best to move through it as quickly as possible. And we can get to sort of the heart of the discussion, if you will.
Please do.
Okay, thank you for that. So if you could let me know through verbal when you see that screen, it would be appreciated.
You see it, and we see the final presentation version.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that, Mr. Chair. So as I sort of had indicated, so our agenda today is really to sort of cover off the 5 points which are listed on this screen. So we'll begin by sort of setting some context for Planning Committee's benefit, just sort of touching in and sort of describing Council's strategic plan for 2021 and 2022. From there, we'll sort of look at just generally Georgian Bay's land use planning framework. Obviously, as Planning Committee knows, the planning framework that Georgian Bay uses is much more than just site plan. There's various tools that we have. From there, we'll get into a discussion around site plan control itself, looking at some of the legislative provisions in the Planning Act for site plan control, together with how the township has responded to those legislative opportunities, if you will. And then we'll look more specifically at Georgian Bay site plan control policies, and then jump into a discussion around how we can continue to preserve, or excuse me, enhance and strengthen the existing framework that's in place today. So for Planning Committee's benefit, I'm not sure how many folks have had an opportunity to go and to review this, but on the township's website are some really great documents which describe some recent strategic sort of thinking that Council has gone through. And what's illustrated here on this slide is the outcome of that thought process. And what that does, what these slides are indicating, not only what Georgian Bay Township's vision and mission are, but what its key goals are sort of moving forward. And goal number one is to protect and to preserve the natural environment amongst the 5 goals. And for that goal, there are 8 actions which are listed. I won't read all of them, but I think it is important to highlight that there are references there to sort of obviously climate change and climate footprint, and another reference to placing a greater focus on protecting wetlands and sensitive habitat. And I'm pointing to that one specifically because I believe we may want to have some discussion around that particular point when we get to the end of the presentation. So I'm trying to set up a conversation, if you will. So as Planning Committee members know, Georgian Bay Township, like all communities in the province of Ontario, we function in what's known as a policy-led planning system. And what the graphic on this slide is attempting to do is to summarize how that system works. So we're all very familiar with the Planning Act, and we know that it articulates matters of provincial provincial interest, excuse me, in Section 2 of that act that decision makers have to have regard to. What's been really great about working with Georgian Bay Township over the last year to a little bit now is you see those matters of provincial interest in almost every report that's brought forward for consideration. As planning committee members know, the act gives the lieutenant governor and council the ability to issue policy statements on matters of provincial interest and local land use planning. That is the provincial policy statement. We're working with the Provincial Policy Statement 2020, I believe. And we know that Section 3 of the Planning Act requires that any information or advice or decisions that are made on land use planning matters in the province have to be consistent with that document. So that's a very simple sort of overview of the provincial level. Of course, as planning committee members know, there's a myriad of acts and regulations and policies and guidance documents that come into play to support the provision of land use planning services across Ontario. But this is summarizing the principal pieces of legislation that we deal with. And then at the municipal level, Georgian Bay does function within a two-tier system. So we work with both the Muskoka official plan as well as Georgian Bay's official plan. And what the boxes along the bottom are attempting to describe is the various tools that Georgian Bay Council currently uses to help implement the policies in the plan and therefore achieve the vision of the community that is expressed in that document with every land use planning decision that it makes. And you'll sort of see in the box on the right that site plan is listed there as a tool, and it is a tool that functions in the context of all of these other things, I guess is the principal point to sort of make. So if you're familiar with the Planning Act, as I know that most of you are, you know that when you go into the provisions that relate to site plan control in Section 41, and you look at Section 41.1, you know that the definition, of development is very broadly defined, subject to one really important limitation, and that relates to substantially increasing the size or the usability thereof. But generally speaking, we're looking to apply site plan control to development, which can mean a range of sort of different things. In order to use site plan control, as planning committee members know, that you basically have to have policies in your in effect official plan in order to pass a site plan control bylaw. So what the first paragraph is doing here is sort of describing the legislative reference in Section 41.2, and what the second paragraph is doing is sort of demonstrating how Georgian Bay's official plan responds to that legislative direction. So clearly, Georgian Bay has policies in place which allows it to pass a site plan control bylaw and to use site plan control to achieve its sort of strategic outcomes, if you will. So the Planning Act also sort of provides or establishes provisions, which require that the site plan control bylaw essentially define where site plan will be applied and where it won't be applied. And when you look at how municipalities implement this piece of legislation, and Georgian Bay is no exception, usually you find similar policy direction in the official plan, which is Georgian Bay's case, which is then sort of further articulated in the site plan control bylaw. So again, looking at the second paragraph, Georgian Bay's site plan control bylaw today applies to all lands within the township. And what it says basically is that no development is permitted until the individual enters into a site plan agreement, which is sort of a standard approach, or unless the matter is exempted from site plan control, which takes me to the next slide. And when you sort of delve further into the site plan control bylaw, it does sort of list the sort of exceptions. And the exceptions in Georgian Bay site plan control bylaw are very similar to the exceptions in communities across Ontario, where generally you're sort of exempting what I would sort of describe as smaller scale residential development. But what's interesting about Georgian Bay's bylaw is the exception, which in turn makes reference to the official plan policies. So this is a bit of sort of follow and connect the dots, if you will. I'm going to come to the policies in a second. But the point being that, Georgian Bay has a bylaw. It does apply to all lands within the township. And what I would sort of suggest is the site plan control bylaw and the applicability of that bylaw is sort of governed by the official plan policies, which we'll come to in a moment. So as planning committee members know, there's a whole bunch of matters that can be included within the scope of site plan control. The next 2 or 3 slides, Mr. Chair, list all of those matters. I won't go through them individually, except to sort of point out item number 1. And there's some things there that I've highlighted in bold that I think are really important in the context of this discussion. And so the reference in item 1 to the facilities and works that are required under clause 7A are sort of really important. And I'll come to that in a moment. So basically you're looking for plans that show the locations of your buildings and structures, and drawings which illustrate certain things, which are really designed to allow the decision-making authority to understand the change that is being proposed, how that relates to its surrounding context, and how that change will impact the natural environment, and how that impact on the natural environment, again, can be mitigated. So this slide describes some additional matters that are included within the scope of site plan, as does this slide, and I'm happy to go back through these, Mr. Chair, at the end of the presentation, just as sort of interest in time, in case there's any questions on those. But what I want to do is really sort of come to the items that are listed in 7A. So that previous legislative reference, this slide begins to list or includes, excuse me, those matters that are listed in 7A. And when you look at those items as they're sort of articulated in the Act, they are quite broad and comprehensive. Not as broad and comprehensive as the conditions of approval that an approval authority may affix to a consent decision, or a draft approval of a condominium or a subdivision. As planning committee members know, the legislative reference for those tools, there's a provision there that says any other condition that the approval authority deems to be reasonable, which is quite broad. Site plan doesn't have that same language, so it is somewhat prescribed yet still broad. So generally, you're looking at the widenings of highways, which is what's really sort of addressed in 1 or 2. You're looking at parking, you're looking at walkways and walkway ramps, other means of pedestrian access, facilities that are designed with accessibility in mind, lighting, flood lighting, landscaping, which is what item number 6 talks about, waste and garbage removal in item number 7, any easements that are required, for sort of drainage, if you will, sanitary sewage facilities and other public utilities. 9 is a really important one because it talks about the grading and the alteration and the elevation of the contour of the land. And so thinking about surface water flows and stormwater flows and all of those things, which are very important within the context of Georgian Bay and other waterfront communities. And then, of course, as the section 7 goes on, it talks about the owner's obligation to maintain those features at their own expense and at their own risk, that there's a requirement to enter into an agreement, and that the agreement can be sort of registered on title, basically. So site plan control is a very important tool within the planning toolbox, if you will, because of that ability to register the agreement on title, and the approval authority has the ability to enforce that agreement over time. And in my experience, implementing site plan in other communities, when I say over time, I've seen instances where in other communities we have taken action to enforce site plans that are 20 to 25 years of age. And the site plans, still do stand the test of time, if you will, even after that length of time. So this is my point about agreements being registered on title, and they can be enforced. Now, when you look at Georgian Bay's official plan, and you look in section I 5.1, it's a very important section in the plan because it effectively sets out the scope of authority for the use of site plan within the township. And I haven't listed all of the policies that are there. They're quite numerous. I think they're at least 1.5 to almost 2 pages in length. But what I wanted to do is just sort of touch in on what sort of some of the key policies could be in the context of this discussion. So in item A, it talks about site plan being used importantly to mediate the relationship between the development and natural heritage features and areas. And I'll come to that again. It's capitalized as a series of terms because it is a defined term within the official plan. So that's very important. The township has indicated that it wishes to use site plan to ensure the maintenance or the restoration of vegetation or natural vegetative buffers or the provision of landscaping. So when thinking about in the context of mediating the relationship between development and natural heritage features, that's an important policy. Item H talks about grading, stormwater management, and sewer disposal. So when I read those words, automatically I begin to think about surface water flows and impact to neighbors, but importantly impacts to adjoining bodies of water and how we're collectively ensuring that the quality of the water is maintained over time. Item M, talks about on-site phosphorus management, which in turn is described in section D225 of the plan. And then item N talks about water quality impact assessments, which again are articulated in section D2210 of the official plan. So quite a robust policy framework as it relates to the township's intent to use site plan to achieve its strategic outcomes to protect and preserve the natural environment. So the final slide, Mr. Chair, is just I wanted to check in on the definition of natural heritage features and areas. So when you go to the plan, you see that term, you go to the glossary of terms at the end of the official plan, you come to this definition for natural heritage features and areas, which largely corresponds to the definitions that are outlined within the provincial policy statement. Again, understanding the framework and the policy-led system that we all operate in. So currently, right now, the official plan defines the natural heritage features and areas as anything that is significant in sort of largely a provincial sense. So significant wetlands, provincially significant coastal wetlands, fish habitat, the habitat of endangered and threatened species, and ANSIs, or areas of natural and scientific interest. So I'll connect now, I'll pause here, but I'll go back to the beginning of the presentation, and I wanted to make the connection between goal number 1 and the reference to wetlands and other features in this statement. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll sort of conclude my presentation. I'll stop sharing the screen and would love to get into a discussion with Planning Committee around that policy framework, the administration and the use of the tool, and potential improvements that could be made to both of those things to better achieve Council's strategic outcome of protecting and preserving the natural environment. Thank you for both your patience and your attention while I went through those slides as quickly as I could.
Thank you, Jason. One quick question before we start. I am assuming that you're going to send out copies of your presentation to all of us. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Okay. Who would like to start off? Comments, questions? Peter, go ahead.
Thank you. And thanks for that presentation, Jason. I think it helps us put all of this in perspective. In preparation for this meeting, I had a look through the official plan and our site plan control bylaw. And as you pointed out, Jason, the site plan control bylaw exempts residential development, but then brings us back into back to the official plan and includes in site plan control areas identified in the official plan. And when I look at the official plan under the general waterfront policies, it requires site plan control for substantial development, all substantial development, without defining what substantial development is. And then if you drill down to some of the waterfront community policies, and I think this applies in Go Home Bay, Cognoscine, Wawataysi, for example, it requires site plan for development or site plan control for all development, leaving out the word substantial. And then if I look at the general provisions in I-5, it does say that the site plan control bylaw can exempt certain items such as, and it lists, for example, docks, decks. But when I go to our site plan control bylaw, there is no express exemption for those types of items. So I guess it left me a little confused, and it left me wondering from an administrative perspective, how does our planning staff deal with this where an application for development is made, say in Go Home Bay, is every application in Go Home Bay directed towards site plan control? If I apply for a building permit to put up a dock, does that get me into site plan control? And how does the staff make that determination as to what applications need to go through site plan control and what don't?
Dr. Estella?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to, oh, my screen just changed. That was Member Fold speaking, if I'm correct. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Sorry about that. So staff, registered professional planners, we're required to use our professional judgment in some cases. And when we review each application, we apply our judgment, we review what the policies are and how they would apply on a case-by-case basis. So depending where we are in the township, as Member Folds astutely noted, that there are different policies in our official plan that provide staff that direction as to which tools we should use. And we rely on that, and we rely on our professional judgment, taking into the information provided in the application. And it is on a case-by-case basis. You have noticed that there are some discrepancies. Absolutely, I completely acknowledge that. And some of those discrepancies, they need to be dealt with at perhaps a more higher level fulsome review of policy that is beyond the scope of anything that we currently have underway. So that could be something that would be looked at as part of an official plan review and tied into it and updated of the site plan control bylaw. So you are correct that there are differences and there are discrepancies. And with those, I'll go back. We have to make judgment calls as professionals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Estella. Peter, do you want to follow
Yeah,
up?
so is it your interpretation that the provisions in the official plan and the site plan control bylaw give staff the option of requiring or subjecting an application to site plan control rather than a requirement that they must go through site plan control if there is a substantial development, or in some cases a development?
Through you, Chair Hazelton, to Member Folds. So in some cases, the official plan, for example, in the Cognition area, it is pretty specific that site plan control is required. As you've noted, the term substantial, that could be up for debate. And where it says substantial development, that requires a judgment call on a case-by-case basis with what's proposed. So it gives us the flexibility, but with flexibility also comes responsibility. And we have to make that judgment call. I hope, have I answered your question sufficiently? Have I missed anything?
I understand that where you're dealing with the portion of the official plan that refers to substantial development, that there is a judgment call there. In the case of Cognition or Go Home Bay, where it just refers to all development, does that still give you discretion, or are you bound by that?
My interpretation as a registered professional planner, if it says all development, then that means all development. That's pretty black and white. It's a binary decision.
So that would include, for example, if I apply for a building permit to build a dock, then I need to go through site plan control?
I would say in general, based on the interpretation of the official plan, that would be the guidance, and that would be what we would look at. And on a case-by-case basis. I would say typically for those particular areas that you've described, I would be asking for site plan control.
Bill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I have a number of sort of general impressions about the use of site plan control, I guess, in the township. You know, just related to the discussion that Peter initiated there about when it's applied. I didn't review the 6 Mile Lake Waterfront Plan, but I'm under the impression that it's pretty much invoked with any sort of application, you know, no matter how minor, like for a minor variance, for example, no matter how minor it might be. My impression was the township uses it as an opportunity to bring that property, you know, into the, you know, to use site plan control, to bring it into control, I guess, with the objective of using it to protect the natural environment, the trees and the landscaping and so on in its natural condition. So, you know, and I guess if we look at the goal that's enunciated here, and the impression I have of why we had site plan control in the first place for low density development was that objective of preserving and protecting the natural environment. So, but, you know, having said that, that seems to have been the policy intent for some time. And I guess we're reviewing it here to perhaps improve its function in that respect. But I think where it falls quite short is, you know, we've got the policy there, and, you know, we do invoke the site plan review process. We do register site plans and so on. But in the process, I would suggest there's not much review of the site plan and, you know, policies and guidance about the criteria for an appropriate site plan. You know, what's necessary in the site plan to preserve or ensure that you're going to preserve the natural environment. And so, you know, that review part seems to be missing. And, you know, to my knowledge, I think we probably fall short, very short on the enforcement side of it as well, like in terms of inspecting what's happening when the development takes place, you know, to what degree is the site plan being followed. So I guess, you know, before we get into the weeds on this, I think we need to have some serious thought as to, you know, if our objective is to protect and preserve the natural environment primarily, you know, is this mechanism, certainly the way we've been using it, is it really doing the job? You know, particularly in relation to the effort involved in putting all these site plans in place, you know, or are there better mechanisms to achieve what we're trying to do? But, you know, it sort of seems to me that the way we're going here is, you know, properties that don't go through any application process just sit there without the protection of a site plan. And we're kind of using this mechanism, you know, whoever comes forward, we're seizing the opportunity to bring them into this process of having site plans in place. But if they just sit there and we don't monitor them, we don't enforce them, we don't go about trying to ensure that they're good site plans in terms of the natural environment in the first place, you know, I would suggest we really need to think hard and about, you know, what we're really trying to achieve, and is this the best mechanism? But anyway, that's, you know, frankly, that just comes from sort of past experiences and watching what seems to be happening with site plan review. And it sort of connects with, I guess, a lot of issues in the township and in the lakefront communities. Is a lot of times we got great policies, but we kind of fall short on the enforcement side. Anyway, just some overall impressions, and I think I should stop talking then. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Dr. Espella, you want to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate Mr. Winterhalt's comments, especially noting his his background as a planner over the years. The township receives on average about 40 site plan control applications each year. And it is fair to say that enforcement of them is an issue. We do have limited enforcement resources. And enforcement largely comes up in response to matters that have gained profile, either through a matter going to the tribunals, or if complaints are raised to the townships, to the township staff. So it is a legitimate issue. It is a challenge. And perhaps it is worth looking, are there better tools to be using, as the member has raised, rather than site plan for protecting our natural environment? And I think that that's something that could be, I think that's something that would be appropriately addressed as part of the next official plan review that the township undertakes.
I could just ask for a little bit of clarification here. So Dr. Spilly, you just mentioned you get 40 site plan applications per year. And I found the site plan application document on the website. That was interesting. I've gone through on my property. I think I'm on my third site plan. I've never filled out an application. I'm wondering, is the application something that should be filled out every time it's mandated, or is it just a process that you go through to sketch up your property after the fact, after you've been given approval, and then you get that registered? Could you help us understand that?
Very good question, Mr. Chair. So we're going to distinguish between two things here. So we frequently ask applicants for a conceptual site plan as part of any Planning Act application or submission that they make. Conceptual site plan is different than site plan control. So site plan control is a formal process that was discussed by Jason, or presented by Jason in the presentation this morning. So that's a formal process that's permitted under the Planning Act. And site plan control, we do have an application for that. And if the township requires site plan control as part of an application, there is a form that needs to be filled out. There is an application package that needs to be submitted. Minimally, with a site plan drawing, there might be additional information requested depending on the specifics of the application. This may be addressed through pre-consultation or an informal consultation with planning staff, depending on the nature of the application. There are 3 fees that are a component of this, of a formal site plan control application. So the fee depends on the nature of the application, and that depends on the proposed use. The township may and frequently does require a study or a deposit for studies. That's typically in relation to peer review, if there's to be an environmental assessment or a study related to something like fish habitat, if you will. Frequently in the case of docks, if there's provincially significant wetlands or an environmental protection zoning or fish habitat identified. And then there's also a third component, and that's to cover the legal preparation of the actual site plan agreement. So 2 separate things. I hope that helps to clarify. So there's this conceptual site plan that's provided, and then there's, for most applications that are done at a municipality, and then there's the more formal site plan control process that we're discussing today.
So just to follow up on that, if I come in for a minor variance application, pretty much always it's going to be required that I go through and I define a site plan. And so I'm assuming that this new site plan or application for site plan control is a new application that may not have existed, 4 or 5 years ago. Just, I'll pause there. Can you confirm that? Because I'm not aware of any application that you had to go through. It was basically an edict from an approval of a minor variance or other planning changes that required you to have a site plan, and the process was simply to sketch up a drawing and submit it, and then pay the money to have it registered.
I don't have a firm answer as to the date where the township initiated site plan control. My suspicion is it's at least as old as the bylaw, because we have to have a bylaw to implement site plan control.
I mean, site plans have been, I had one in '93, and I'm sure they existed many, many years earlier. I was just more interested in the process because the formal application process didn't seem to exist. But if I'm going to just kind of blurt out a couple of more things, if I may. First of all, I was delighted to see some of the things that Jason included in his presentation, where he was highlighting the needs of the official plan to drive things that could be controlled in the site plan. When I look at the site plan application, though, there is no mention of any environmental matters, the possible need for reports, or the likely need for peer reviews, which would be at the applicant's expense. So that's a bit of a concern there. I guess the other concern I have is, if I'm doing a minor variance or a bylaw amendment, I'm being required to produce a current survey of the property. There's no requirement in the site plan application process to use that survey to then sketch up the site plan. And so it's quite likely the site plan could be completely separate and distinct from what the survey is showing as a layout of the property, the buildings, etc. And I've talked too much here. Jack, please jump in.
There seems to be some confusion between conceptual site plans that's used for building applications and site plan control documents, and they're not the same thing at all. So when you're applying for a building permit, you're going to have to include a site plan, but it's not a site plan for site plan control, which is a totally separate issue. They're not the same thing at all. So if you're in an area that we're doing a minor addition to your property, you're not going to have to go for site plan control. Now, Cognizine in areas like that got a little confused, in my opinion, some years ago, and decided to include site plan control as part of all of the building permit applications. That was never the intention of the site plan control process, and it's probably a mistake for Cognizine and such to suggest that site plan control should be implemented in every case, in every building permit. Now, you've gone for permits in the past where obviously site plan control had did not come into play at all. And in most cases, in most places, site plan control isn't an issue unless the development is substantial. There's that big word again. So they're not the same thing. There is some confusion over what a site plan for building permit application versus a site plan for site plan control. They're totally different processes. They're not the same thing at all. And it's unfortunately they use the same terminology, but they're really not the same thing.
Beth, did you want to weigh in on that? Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Mr. Chair, that what you seem to be referring to in your past experience with projects was the site plan agreement that you would have entered into as a condition of approval of your minor variance or rezoning or whatever it may have been. I think under site plan control applications, and this is where I would like some clarity for staff, if there's been some 40 such applications, the way I read this is that if it is minor, and minor seems to be defined as up to 538 square foot addition or extension to an existing legal structure, then that means that somebody potentially who has a small lot, an old existing cottage created or built prior to 1981, very close to the water's edge because there were no bylaws in place at that time, that they can make application for up to a 530 square foot addition without having to go to council for endorsement, because I read for the very first time, and I hadn't realized this until that package was circulated, that this all seems to be, if it's minor, within staff's purview to develop. So I guess my concern is, in cases where you are close to the water's edge, should those matters be coming to council, and should they be subject to site plan agreement when, you know, something so close to the water could have detrimental impact on the environment and water quality? So that's sort of one comment I wanted to make. As it relates to enforcement, and a couple of members have mentioned that here today, I have heard in the past our council saying, well, you know, we really don't have the means to enforce our site plan agreements because we don't have the staff. So it's really up to, on a complaint basis by neighbors, that maybe the township is made aware that somebody has not complied with the terms of their site plan agreement. Well, I find that very interesting, and I'm not sure what the township's position is going to be today in terms of enforcement, but how does a neighbor complain other than perhaps he sees something wrong going on, but a site plan agreement that owner would have entered into is a private agreement between that owner and the township. It's not under the public purview. So as it relates to enforcement, if the township expects it's a complaint-based system, I think that's a flawed system. The system, the township should periodically follow up on agreements that are entered into on title, because I've seen 2 cottages on a property where it was a condition that a kitchen had to be removed from another cottage if there was a replacement cottage constructed. And that hasn't happened. And there's a number of such instances. So enforcement is a concern. I think the very minor nature. So if you define minor up to 530 square feet, it means anything over 538 square feet is substantial, I assume. But to have that strictly within staff's purview and not be before council, I find that somewhat concerning. To Jack's comment about, and others about everything being subject to site plan control, obviously we need to look at that. A replacement dock in the exact same situation, if that's term development, shouldn't need a site plan control bylaw or site plan agreement. And the last comment I wanted to make was related to, and Chair Hazelton alluded to this, while the words are there in the official plan that speak to the natural environment, fish habitat, all of those things, Jason, that you'd mentioned, a site plan agreement is not a place where you are required then to do studies that can determine whether a lot can be developed. And we faced a situation in a particular appeal where the staff of the time, I will say, lifted a hold and said, oh, well, we're going to do all those studies as a condition, as a requirement under a site plan agreement. Section 41 of the Planning Act does not allow a municipality to require those environmentally related studies determine appropriateness or suitability for development. Those agreements are entered into when the principle of development has already been established, and you're just trying to nail down that those conditions of approval are actually implemented. Those are just a few comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Dr. Spilla, you wanted to weigh in on this?
I'm going to turn it over to our acting CAO on this matter to comment first, and then I'll follow up.
Through Chair Hazelton, if I may.
Yes.
I think this conversation has gotten very specific, and the topic of discussion was a high-level overview of site plans. And if there are any further questions, we would accept them and bring a report forward in the future. But at this time, I don't think we're in any position to be discussing this matter in such detail. If Dr. Espilla wants to add anything to this, or our consultant.
So I'll chime in, and I'll add the comment. There are matters that the township is in current litigation in that we're not going to get into, related to Ontario Land Tribunal matters, and it wouldn't be appropriate for us to get into any more specific detail given the angle that this discussion has started to go, as it would apply to a specific property and certain legal opinions. So we're not going to go there. And I trust you can appreciate the importance for the township that we don't go into this discussion in a public forum.
So
these were just, to you, Mr. Chair, just general observations that relate to the applicability of the current policy regime that is being used. It wasn't specific to a particular application at all.
I will not be commenting further on this matter. I've expressed my reasons why, and we can't go into further detail on this because it could compromise the township's position with respect to ongoing litigation. Thank you.
So Julie, we have what I'll call a conundrum here. We have an enormous amount of expertise of planning experts that we've asked to sit on a committee and provide input. And it sounds like the public forum presents us a challenge. Is there an opportunity for us to have an in-camera session, a closed session, where our planning staff can basically hear from other experts on this topic to help flesh out other ideas that may be very valuable to the township? I think we've started to hear issues raised where there needs to be more attention on this topic. We've got the experts from the community anxious and passionate about weighing in on it. I'm not sure that we want to cut that off. We just need to find a forum where we don't expose the township on the matters that Dr. Espilla has raised. So how do we do that?
Through Chair Hazelton, I would request that you leave that with me. I don't believe we have the platform for in-camera or closed session. Again, if you want to send your concerns forward to Dr. Espilla and myself, we will mull it over and find a platform to bring it back. But between now and then, I don't think this is the proper platform.
Okay, Peter, you've had your hand up for a while. What did you want to weigh in with?
I have a question, and this goes back to the introductory comments by our acting CAO in regard to our terms of reference, and her comment that this committee is supposed to deal with matters that are referred to us by council. And I guess my question is, has council referred to this committee a specific question relating to site plan control? Or is this just a general discussion for information purposes?
Julie, yes, please.
If I may, Chair Hazelton, I mentioned at the forefront of the meeting that we're revising processes of how items get onto the agenda for this planning committee. I believe this one was general understanding that there were concerns, and in the future, the tentative discussions is that council, through a committee of the whole process, determine what's on the agenda to avoid questions like this, where we aren't really 100% clear where the source of the conversation comes from. So definitely we're trying to improve, as we are in many things at the township, how things land on the agenda and to ensure that we're in line with our terms of reference. So again, we're new and we're working on it, and we have flagged that, you know, sometimes we're not always in line with our terms of reference. So we're going to work on it so to ensure that we have proper guidance in the future.
Thanks, Julie. Ian, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm trying to, I guess, understand that we seem to be sort of talking in many directions, yet Chair Hazelton, I received earlier in the week, I guess it was the bylaw that looks like it was enacted in February for site plan control, yet we're discussing it. I guess as Member Hope pointed out, there seems to be sort of issues in some of the shoreline communities that would include Cognisheen, Goham Bay, and Wawatasi, where it requires site plan control in all applications or in all development. So is it more looking at down the road, if we are to look at sort of changes to the official plan, we take those issues to those communities and say, we've got an issue here that makes it very difficult to sort of navigate and sort of planning development without having to go through site plan control. So again, it looks like the bylaw has already been put in place. So are we just discussing a bylaw that's already there, or changes to a bylaw that was just passed in February?
Dr. Spilla, do you wanted to respond?
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. Through you to Member Davis. Member Davis, excellent point that you've raised. The input that we're getting today is really valuable for future official plan reviews, and we are taking notice of that. I would like to clear up. Would like to provide some clarity for the committee. So in a typical year, the planning department provides comment on an average of about 530 building permit applications. We average about 3 official plan amendments. Can't remember the exact order of magnitude, but I believe it's in the order of about 30 to 40 zoning bylaw amendment applications. And then there's about 18 or 19 active subdivision phases that are underway. So when you think about all of those different applications that the department receives and works on each year, and that we actually we require site plan control for an average of about 40 of them. So putting that into perspective, that might be maybe 1 in 11, 1 in 12 applications. So it's not everything, but there are certain, as you've noted, there are certain areas where we are guided to or required to implement site plan control. And some of those are from the official plan. And I think it would be very worthwhile to have that discussion with our communities within the township of Georgian Bay and our various partners and agencies as part of the next official plan review. Thank you.
Ian, did you want to keep a follow-up or?
No, I took my hand down. I think Dr. Aspila, I think, sort of answered my sort of concern. Ultimately, I'm trying to sort of grasp the many sort of facets of this discussion. And at the same time, Chair Hazelton, I was looking at, I guess, the application, trying to compare it to the bylaw itself, and I just see some inconsistencies. Only because it shows exclusions for residential sort of development. Yet on the application, it shows residential as a requirement in terms of a fee associated with that. So is the application and the bylaw, are they meshed, or is the application still under development specific to the bylaw that was enacted in February?
So just a point of clarification, your idea of February is accurate, but it's February of 2020, so that's 2 years ago. So just to help staff.
Sorry, I
okay.
didn't look at the date.
So the other key characteristic is the topic of site plan. I believe ended up on the list of items for the planning committee as a result of some discussions that we had in CAO or planning committee or whatever, where there were some concerns expressed about the appropriateness of using a site plan to manage the environmental aspects. And so Jason has shared with us that site plans can have an impact in managing some of these environmental matters. And that's a good thing. In my opinion, they are matters that have come from the OP. And so there are many of us who would be concerned that if it's in the OP, it's too easily ignored, and we've had many experiences of that. So maybe there's needing some change there. And then Beth has shared with us that in cases where you have no existing development and you're not looking to deploy a site plan to control already approved development, you have a situation where probably the site plan process is not appropriate to control a property prior to development being approved for that property, if I can summarize what Beth had said on that front. So I think there's a whole bunch of related topics here that need to be explored. I will accept that we perhaps can't get into the details of some of those things at the moment, and I'll ask our acting CAO, Julie, to help us understand what forum we can do that and leverage the expertise we have here. But I think that I don't think this is a simple topic. I think that on one hand, we for example, we listen to Jason's presentation and we say, great, all this stuff is in there, but I can probably rattle off half a dozen examples of where the environmental matters were completely ignored when it came to the site plan process. And so what I'm concerned about, and what I think our committee would like to weigh in on, is how do we establish hooks between the environmental policies that we have and ensure that those are acted on when applications and zoning bylaw amendments and minor variances and site plans, when those things are put in place. And also, how do we ensure that we're not delegating all this enormous control? I think Beth had highlighted that, the ability of delegating to staff, a 500 square foot addition. I think that's non-trivial, and I'm not sure that council understood that when we approved this 2 years ago. So that may be something we want to revisit, and I'll pause there. And Peter, you have your hand up and have been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't want to monopolize this conversation, but I do have a comment that might be helpful to the planners in terms of some history and because I was involved in the development of the Go Home Bay Community Plan back in 2004, 2005, and the OP amendments that were put in place at that time. And my recollection is that the intention at the time, with respect to the the official plan provision for site plan control for all development in the Go Home Bay area, I think it's fair to say the intention was that if there was a planning application, so if someone was applying for a variance or rezoning or OP amendment, that there would be either a requirement for site plan control or at least an option for site plan control at the discretion of the planner. I don't think it was the intention, and others may disagree with me, but I don't think it was the intention that every building permit application would be subject to site plan control. So that if it was a building permit application that was completely in line with compliant with zoning and didn't require a planning application, I don't think it was the community's intention that that would be subject to site plan control. So I hope maybe that gives you some context in terms of interpreting what's in the official plan, whether that's in fact what the official plan states or not. I guess that's a discussion for another day, but I think that was our thinking at the time.
Thank you, Peter. Move on to Ian.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for that clarification. And I suspect we probably had similar sort of objectives in Cognition specific to, like you said, under the control of a planning application, minor variance, amendment, etc. There is that opportunity for site plan control on the part of the planning staff. But so looking, I guess, again, I'm a little bit embarrassed that I looked at the bylaw dated 1920, thinking that it was more recent than that. But can we look at that bylaw and make some minor changes to it that would, I think, give a little bit more discretion to the planning department to sort of move away from site plan control in sort of all areas of I guess, the coastal communities that right now certainly have it? Or do we have to sort of go through some form of amendment on the official plan in those communities down the road?
Those are good questions, and if I could ask staff to record them, we may or may not be able to address them now, but I see Dr. Spilla's got his hand up. So did you want to offer an initial comment?
I'll offer a brief and initial comment. I think one of the messages that's coming across today, Mr. Chair, from some of the members is that some of the policies in our official plan may not be achieving the intent that they were originally created for back in 2014 through the consultations that occurred back in 2013, 2014. And staff are taking note based on this information and other information that there appears to be some appetite for reviewing our official plan and the associated planning tools and bylaws that we implement it through for the purposes of protecting and enhancing our natural environment. And that's a topic I'm very passionate about. I believe it's in line with council that it is the most important and pressing issue for the township of Georgian Bay from the planning front. So that's the message I've received from some of the members of planning committee today. And it is noted. Thank you.
Thank you. And Beth, you wanted to weigh in as well.
Oh, I was just only going to say, Mr. Chair, that I agree with Member Folds and Davis as it relates to, any application. It shouldn't apply if somebody has made an application for a building permit and it complies with all zoning setbacks, maximum GFA. It's only where the envelope is pushed or through an amendment or amendment to the bylaw or minor variance where there's conditions that are imposed that say, augment vegetation, for instance. It shouldn't have to apply to replacement of something that's existing if you're not changing it in location or size. or a new building structure, accessory structure, if it totally complies with all the provisions of the official plan and zoning bylaw. So I think if there's some clarification on that going forward, that would be helpful.
One follow-up comment, Dr. Spella, the reading of the OP that I have done and that conversations I've had with others suggest that the OP has a lot of really rich words in it that are excellent. The challenge we seem to be having in our township over the last many years is the activation, if you will, of those magic phrases, and how do they get considered and prioritized when development is taking place. And so I think it's probably less an issue of what's in the OP and more an issue of how do we provide consistency in an interpretation of and enactment of those OP policies when development takes place. And so, this site plan topic is one where there is a belief that some of these OP statements can be enacted. Perhaps there are other paths that we need to be looking at, and I think that's an important distinction. That I think the OP is less broken than the process is to enact the very valuable wording that the OP has. Go ahead, Chris.
Mr. Chair, thank you. You've raised a good point. And if I can circle back to the presentation that was provided by Jason earlier in this council meeting, it's there's two things I want to go back to. So first of all, there's a hierarchy of the planning mechanisms that we have to work with. And at the Township of Georgian Bay, there's the legislation, there's the PPS, the provincial policy statement that's prepared under the Planning Act. But then we have the District of Muskoka official plan, we have the Township of Georgian Bay official plan, we have our zoning bylaw, and we have all of our other bylaws. We haven't discussed the site alteration bylaw today, but that's also very relevant for protection of the natural environment on waterfront development. Aside from that, I'll echo Jason's point. We want to tell the story from the beginning. We want to tell the story about our process, our business process from the beginning, and we want to get it correct. So what we've heard today and at other public meetings in the time that I've been with the township has been, there are some issues between our official plan, our zoning bylaw, and all of our other implementation tools for these documents. In order to get it right, we need to start at the beginning. And in this case, the beginning, this is my professional opinion, is the official plan. And we need to confirm that we have it right. It was prepared 2013, 2014, approved in 2014. That's some time ago. Lots of changes have happened in our township. Issues have changed, perspectives have changed. So I acknowledge your points. I thank the committee for all of the feedback that they've provided today. It's useful. We've taken notes on that. Site plan control is but one tool that we have to protect and to preserve and to enhance our natural environment. It's a valuable tool. It's an important tool. It's not the only tool. And we are hearing that there are issues with the process. I recommend we deal with this holistically rather than on a piecemeal basis by looking at just one bylaw. Let's get the story right from the beginning to tell the story of how we want development to happen in the Township of Georgian Bay. And I think I've made my point, and like I said, I appreciate the comments and the feedback provided by Planning Committee today. It's been a wholesome session. Jason and I have received some valuable input on the site plan control matter, and we'll take that away. And thank you.
Thank you. So we are coming up to the time window here. I certainly know that some of us would love to continue chatting about this, but I think we'll defer that for another day. We don't have any items officially on the agenda of new business, but there is one item that I would like to speak to. Not with us today is Ava Barnett, and she has written to staff asking that she retire from our committee. She has moved on to a new full-time job that doesn't give her the flexibility to participate in the committee. And so she has submitted her resignation. So she is not with us, but she's also not going to be attending future meetings, but I thought it was important for everyone to understand that. Dr. Spiller, did you want to expand on that at all?
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. Yes, Member Barnett, she shared that information through staff, and I'm saddened this year ago. I'm grateful that she's obtained an excellent opportunity that is going to benefit her, and anyway, we'll miss her presence and participation on this committee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to wrap things up before our official deadline. Are there any other comments that anyone would like to offer briefly? And there being none, rather than providing resolutions for council to consider, I think the comments that our acting CAO Julie had offered earlier, which is we're in the process of revisiting the way we produce agendas and topics that we discuss. So we will exercise that process and come up with an agenda for our next meeting. And I have an end of meeting resolution being, be it resolved that the planning committee adopts the minutes, sorry, be it resolved that the planning committee does now adjourn at 11:58 until April 29th, 2022, or at the call of the chair. May I have a mover? Beth, and a seconder. Ian, and all in favor? Thank you. I will call the meeting adjourned. Thank you very, very much for your input and discussion today, and look forward to seeing you again on the 29th.